The phone rang at 3:07 a.m., slicing through the dark like a siren, and Mark Holloway knew before he answered that whatever waited on the other end would change everything. 3 years after the divorce, 3 years of teaching himself how to sleep lightly in case his son coughed or cried, 3 years of learning how to live with a quiet that felt louder than shouting. This call carried a weight that pressed straight into his chest. The night outside their small Ohio house was frozen and still, and the glow from the kitchen nightlight painted long shadows on the wall as Mark sat up in bed, heart pounding, already bracing for pain he had no name for yet. Before the story pulls you deeper, take a second to like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel if you believe in kindness, forgiveness, and second chances. Stories like this remind us why those things still matter. Mark had not planned on becoming a single father at 36. Life before the divorce had been busy but full, built around long workdays at a regional trucking company, soccer practices, and Sunday dinners that once felt permanent. When the marriage ended, it did not explode, it slowly starved. His ex-wife, Rachel Holloway, drifted into a different life with different priorities, and one quiet afternoon she packed a suitcase and left behind a marriage that had grown thin with resentment and silence. What remained was Mark and his 7-year-old son, Noah, learning how to cook for two, how to manage homework and laundry, and how to answer questions that had no simple explanations. The years after were not dramatic, but they were heavy. Mark worked overtime to keep the house, skipped vacations, and learned to smile through exhaustion, so Noah would never feel like a burden. He carried guilt like a second spine, wondering where he failed, wondering if loving someone should ever feel like losing yourself. Rachel stayed distant, showing up late to scheduled visits, missing birthdays, promising calls that never came. Mark stopped expecting anything from her, because expecting hurt more than accepting reality. That night, when the call came, Mark's first thought was of Noah sleeping down the hall, his superhero blanket tangled around his legs. The second thought was of Rachel, a woman he had trained himself not to think about anymore. The voice on the line was calm but urgent, explaining that Rachel had been rushed into emergency surgery after a sudden medical crisis, complications, consent issues, no immediate family nearby. Mark was listed as the last reachable contact. He listened, numb, while the weight of the words settled into him like cold water. He stood in the kitchen afterward, gripping the edge of the counter, staring at the old family photo taped to the fridge. It showed the three of them at a county fair in Indiana, Noah on his shoulders, Rachel laughing with her eyes closed. Mark had almost thrown that picture away more than once. Now it felt like a message from another lifetime. Anger rose first, sharp and hot. After everything, after walking away, after leaving him to build a life from the rubble, how could she still reach into his world like this? But anger gave way to something quieter and more dangerous, responsibility. Getting Noah up in the middle of the night was not an option. Mark called his neighbor, Mrs. Evelyn Carter, a retired church secretary with kind eyes and insomnia. She answered on the second ring, already awake, and agreed to come over without questions. By the time Mark drove toward the hospital in Columbus, the sky was just beginning to pale at the edges, that thin blue that comes before dawn. The highway lights blurred as exhaustion and memory tangled together, and Mark realized how little time had passed since he last stood beside Rachel in a hospital room, waiting for Noah to be born. Hospitals have a way of shrinking time. Hours stretched into something shapeless as Mark sat in a plastic chair, hands clasped, staring at a blank wall. He was no longer her husband, no longer her partner, yet here he was, the one asked to decide, to stand in the gap where family should have been. The surgeon eventually explained the risks, the urgency, the need for authorization to proceed with an additional life-saving intervention. Mark's mind screamed with unfairness. This was not his burden anymore. He had already paid in sleepless nights and broken promises. But then he thought of Noah. He thought of the boy's quiet sadness when his mother missed another visit, the way he pretended not to care. He thought of the kind of man he wanted his son to become. And in that moment, Mark understood that this choice was not about Rachel alone. It was about who he was when it mattered most. When dawn finally broke, pale light crept through the hospital windows, and Mark felt older than he had the night before. He signed what needed signing, spoke when spoken to, and waited again. Memories flooded him uninvited. Rachel singing off-key in the car, the way she cried when Noah took his first steps, the nights they stayed up dreaming about a future that never arrived. Pain softened into something like grief, not for the marriage, but for the people they used to be. The surgery lasted hours. Mark paced, prayed in clumsy, half-forgotten words, and checked his phone for updates from Mrs. Carter. When the surgeon finally returned, exhaustion lined his face, but there was relief in his voice. Rachel had made it through. The next days would be critical, but she was alive. Mark closed his eyes, feeling something loosen in his chest that he had not realized was clenched so tightly. Life did not suddenly become simple after that. Mark brought Noah to visit later that week, careful and gentle, explaining only what a child needed to know. Rachel lay pale but breathing, machines humming softly around her. Noah held her hand, and for the first time in years, Mark saw his son smile without effort in her presence. It broke something open in him. Healing, he realized, was not loud. It arrived quietly through small, undeserved mercies. Over the following weeks, Mark found himself helping in ways he never expected. Driving Rachel to follow-up appointments, picking up prescriptions, listening, really listening, when she spoke about fear and regret. She admitted how lost she had been, how pride kept her away longer than she ever intended. Mark did not excuse the past, but he stopped letting it poison the present. Boundaries remained, but bitterness began to fade. What changed most was Mark himself. He felt lighter, not because life was easier, but because he had chosen compassion over resentment. Noah noticed it too. Their home felt warmer, laughter easier. The quiet no longer felt like an enemy. Mark understood now that forgiveness was not a gift you gave someone else, it was a door you opened for yourself. As the months passed, Rachel recovered slowly. There were no dramatic reunions, no promises of romance. What grew instead was respect, cooperation, and a shared commitment to their son. Mark learned that being someone's last hope did not mean sacrificing yourself. Sometimes it meant showing up with courage when walking away would be simpler. If this story is reaching something deep inside you, please take a moment to like, share, and comment. Your engagement helps stories like this travel to hearts that need them. Just before the ending, here is a special request. Comment the word hope if you believe that people can still choose kindness even after pain. One quiet evening, nearly a year after that 3 a.m. call, Mark tucked Noah into bed and stood by the window, watching snow fall gently over their street. Life was still imperfect. There were bills, tired days, unanswered questions, but there was also peace. Mark thought back to the moment the phone rang and how close he came to letting bitterness decide for him. He realized that the call did not just save Rachel's life, it reshaped his own. Sometimes the hardest calls come not to break us, but to remind us who we are capable of being when love, responsibility, and grace collide in the dark.